Well, hello everybody. Welcome into Great Atmosphere here on this Friday of March 22nd, 2024. One day removed from our spring equinox. We are firmly astronomically and meteorologically in the springtime now, which is great news for all. Obviously, it'll be warming up quite a bit, and we'll see just how much precipitation that we're expecting over the next 3 months of spring. We'll get into that in a little bit. We'll also take a look at the short-term models just to make sure what this system that we're currently experiencing today and into tomorrow is going to be doing here for the southeast, along with maybe some medium to long-term outlooks thanks to the EuroAI model, which has been performing quite admirably in its first month of function. But before we get started, just want to remind you to subscribe to the channel, hit the bell as well for notifications. I'll be doing videos like this 2 or 3 times a week during the week, highlighting different interesting weather phenomenon throughout the contiguous U.S. with a slight focus more on the southeastern portion, which is my area of expertise, along with anything else that might be interesting going along in the world of atmospheric science, which definitely starting next week we'll be talking about the incoming total solar eclipse that'll be going across the contiguous U.S. on April 8th. We'll be talking about that with every video, starting out with a pretty... I'm very excited about doing a very formal, full-on deep dive video onto the eclipse, its history, things to look out for when you're eclipse hunting, what you're going to expect in your part of the country, all kinds of good stuff. That'll be coming next week. Very excited to do that. But before we get into that, we're going to start with today looking at the short-range stuff. And by looking at the short-range, first we're going to start by looking at the true color CONUS imagery from the GOES satellite. And as you can see, we have quite an area of disturbance across pretty much the entire southeastern tier of the U.S. As we talked about earlier in the week, we had an omega block system that was parked out over the western portions of the U.S. We kind of had a situation where the upper level flow was going kind of in this motion, which simulates a Greek letter omega block pattern, which had subsequent low pressures on either side and dominant highs that were in the middle. That has since transformed. It became a high over low Rex block pattern temporarily for about 36 hours, and it has shifted now where everything has kind of filled in completely for the most part. The main low that was situated over the Four Corners region, that was a cutoff low earlier, has now kind of developed more into a shortwave trough within the mean pattern of the subtropical jet. And that's pretty much what we're looking at here. So it's not so much of a shortwave trough. It's actually developed a little bit more cutoff characteristics as it comes over the Texarkana region. But also it's starting to develop a little bit of other things. We also talked about a little shortwave that it's interacting with, part of the giant parent low that's sitting over the Hudson Bay. These two interactions right here, as they move both forward, the northerly mode shortwave is going to be moving more to the southeast, while this one moves more into the northeast. Once it approaches the Appalachian Mountains and starts to move up the coast, these two will start to merge, which will increase the moisture transport that comes out of the Gulf Stream and both the Gulf of Mexico itself, which will create kind of probably a significant coastal flooding event going into tonight and into Saturday. But we can see we can just see from that imagery the general pattern: polar jet coming in like this, subtropical. It's kind of hard to see, but we'll be generally kind of going in this general motion here. And then ultimately we have another diffluent flow aloft atmospheric river. Not a formal atmospheric river, mind you. The North Pacific jet is still in a retraction at the moment, but the overall flow pattern is still diffluent. That's why we are seeing some upper level snows in the Sierra Nevada. And then in the Pacific Northwest Cascadian Plateau, we are still quite wet up in this region. Let's take a look at what the upper level looks like right now. So we do have that we do have that subtropical jet maximum right here, which means on that left exit region of the jet, we do expect to see some increased. If we do our 4-quadrant model right here, left exit region means that we would expect to see more convection and upward motion. And then we may have our little shortwave based off our parent low here in the Hudson Valley, or the Hudson Bay, excuse me. And then we have our little shortwave trough that we've been tracking all week that's been slowly making its way across the United States. And then in that, we are having that same kind of spirit, quite a bit of diffluent flow in this area. And then interestingly, I wasn't sure if this was like a model discrepancy or whatnot that came out of it, but in the Gulf of Mexico right now, there is quite a bit of convection. Could potentially be a significant straight line wind event for areas in the Keys and also in the western portions of Cuba. Particularly, I'm particularly worried about Havana going into tonight. We're going to take a look at that in just a little bit. So, but that's generally what we're looking at the upper levels. Let's see how it looks on the surface. We generally have that low pressure just kind of sitting there dominant and multiple. You have different low centers just kind of sitting and generally spinning in this direction, drawing in colder continental air from the Canadian prairie on its back end. And then also we have our high pressure that's been sitting off of the coast for a while, bringing in even more moisture in a anticyclonic fashion, which is obviously clockwise motion in the surface levels of the atmosphere, bringing in even more moisture. And this is generally the reason why we're expecting a little bit more of a coastal event going up and down New England. This high pressure will start to move off and into the North Atlantic, and that'll generally create a lot more shoreward motion coming off of the ocean. More moisture, more heat goes into it as it interacts with a colder air mass, should create quite a bit more convection along the coastal regions. So areas inland and the mountains actually get a little bit of a break precip wise, I would say, because of that particular motion. The closer that you get to the coast for the majority of the eastern seaboard going in for the next 24 hours, 36 hours potentially, is going to ultimately bear the brunt. So Wilmington, North Carolina, Charleston, Savannah, Georgia, pretty much the whole of the Mid-Atlantic, and then actually quite interestingly, the areas in New England in particular, Cape Cod, Boston, and the Long Island Sound areas. Those are going to be areas that'll see elevated precipitation levels going into this evening. So taking a look at our surface map, we do see our generalized low pressure sitting over the deep south, and then we have inverted high pressure ridging that is coming down from the Canadian prairie, pushing all that cold air down and into the south behind the low. And remember, this is at the surface. And then we do have a little bit of ridging that's kind of like still making its way in and around the Carolinas and Virginia. This is kind of like the concern I would have, because if that ridging starts to create enough, I had the menu drop down there. If the ridging comes in off of the coast and creates enough at the time in the middle of the heating of the day, creates enough sinking motion in the atmosphere that's going to suppress a lot of cloud cover in that particular region of Virginia and the Piedmont of North Carolina, could potentially cause this area to destabilize. Maybe could get some rumbles of thunder in there as we go forward into the probably 8 or 9 o'clock tonight about. But that's just my initial inclination based off seeing that little ridge that extends all the way in, destabilizing this kind of area. But we can take a look quickly at what we've seen in the past 60 days for percentage of normal rainfall. So we are generally, for the most part, across the eastern half of the country, generally above average, with the exception of where the Missouri and the Mississippi, the Ohio River Valley and Mississippi diverge. Still quite wet in that particular region. And then obviously Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas are still struggling with a significant drought in that particular area. This is the area in southeast Kansas, the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles, that's been hit with severe wildfires recently. They still have not gotten a lot of relief over the past couple of months, but there has been improvement in other areas. Areas along the southern Mississippi have been generally much more wet, and they have relieved a lot of drought. Central Texas as well. Areas of the eastern parts of the Midwest on the windward side of the Appalachians and the Alleghenies, they've gotten quite a bit more moisture recently. And then we still have a problem area in the North Carolina coastal plain, along with some areas in the central Piedmont along I-81. Southern Georgia, this is quite interesting as well. Florida has been quite dry starting the year. I think that's probably okay by them, just because they were inundated with precipitation because of the El Nino pattern, keeping the subtropical jet screaming overhead of them all winter. They're probably okay with getting some sunshine going into spring. Taking a look at our closest U.S. Drought Monitor that was just released yesterday. all across the east, generally drought is not an issue, with the exception of that area of the coastal plain of North Carolina. But we do have extreme drought in northeastern Iowa. We have severe drought in both Minnesota and Wisconsin, extending into the UP of Michigan, and then generally across New Mexico, Arizona, and West Texas. That's where we see another area of drought. Another area of concern as well is in northern Idaho and western Montana. This is areas that desperately need more snow to kind of build that snowpack. So areas to the east will generally have a good amount of moisture going into the planting season. That's just an interesting kind of development there that hasn't really remedied itself yet. But we can also take a look at what their seasonal 3-month drought outlook looks like. If it wants to load for us, I would expect, just because we're in the transitional months of April and spring, areas where you would expect to kind of be in that tornado alley kind of area. Those are areas where we would expect to see increased areas of moisture. So anywhere in Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, and even southwestern Iowa, CPC does expect for that drought relief to come in. We also talked about last week the extension of the dry line kind of making its way off the Rockies and into west and central Texas. That's going to be more of a problem, creating a little bit more of a drought issuance for the western portions of Texas going into the next few months. It's that time of year when the dry line typically does have that interaction, but there are some climatic factors that are playing into the fact that it's going to be a weaker monsoon season for the Four Corners region. Not a lot of moisture is coming in because of the El Nino offset, as we start to transition into more of an ENSO neutral time frame. So there's a lot of things to consider in that particular part. Drought relief up in northeastern Wyoming and southern Montana, but we do have areas where we expect to see the drought to continue, and unfortunately Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa are still in those, along with western Montana and northern Idaho. West Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, no relief for them either, but anywhere in the southeast and the south central areas, south central plains, we'll expect to see some drought relief according to the Climate Prediction Center. So let's take a look at the short term here. We have our day 1 outlook for convection according to the Severe Weather Prediction Center. Generally along the panhandle of Florida, we're going to have a marginal risk, and then I talked about how the Florida Keys might be introducing a little bit more of a straight line wind event going into this evening. You can barely see it because it's being hidden by the Outlook legend itself. But the only slight risk available today in the U.S. is for the Florida Keys and the far, far, far southern panhandle. And the primary risk, of course, is that wind threat. 5% hail, 5% tornado, which would be like obviously a waterspout driven kind of event, maybe a bookend storm as it makes its way down further south. If it bow echoes, that would be my first guess as to that particular type of mesoscale system. But we'll take a look at that in a second. So let's take a look at some dew points to kind of get us an understanding of just how much moisture and heat there is in the atmosphere. Is a pretty well organized warm sector across the southeast. That's why we are seeing such an area of extreme cloudiness across pretty much the entire east of the U.S. That is in part due to the increased amount of dew points, a lot of moisture in the atmosphere. And of course, the closer the dew points get to the actual surface temperature themselves, as how saturated the atmosphere is, which creates clouds. So, as we move forward in time, going through and into the weekend, we can see that the dew points generally, as we get high pressure building in behind the system, will start to crash. We'll dry out, and clouds will start to dissipate across majority of the east. And then, as we get into the early parts of the work week, we can see that as the high pressure sits over the east, it'll start to open up the Gulf as it moves further into the east and into the Atlantic, creating dew points that'll extend all the way up and into Minnesota and Wisconsin, creating actually a quite significant potential wintry weather event for areas right there, just because since the high pressure that had preceded it was going to be bringing cold and dry continental air mass. That means that any of the moisture that comes and interacts with it on the back end will eventually, more than likely, freeze in midair and come down as snow going into next week. And then generally, and then after that, we get into the next weekend, and then we really start to open up the Gulf. Quite a bit of moisture coming in to the latter portions of next weekend. We're going to have to take a look and see just how severe of an event that actually turns out to be. According to the EuroAI model, there are some things to be concerned about going into next weekend from a severe point of view. So let's take a look at the NAN 3-kilometer model. This is a high-resolution convective model. So let's take a look at what it looks like for this particular system going into this evening. We still have that low that is making its way up and across. Majority of the flow coming in and off of the Gulf of Mexico out ahead of it, obviously, in typical patterns. Then we have, it'll have a very weak frontal boundary on the back end of it, looks like, just because we have the merging of that northern mode trough at the same time. You can see how these two systems are starting to kind of merge. You see the first one is very, very weak just because it doesn't have a lot of moisture up and in that area, but the energy certainly is there. The moisture is definitely much more contained and has more energy in general in the southern mode. And as those two forces kind of collide there, we see it kind of start to extend and become a pretty significant wintry event in northern portions of New England and the upstate of New York as we go forward in time. And as far as looking at the timings in the southeast before we get too far ahead of ourselves, looks like the majority of the rain starts to affect us in the southeast, at least in the Carolinas, I'll add, probably around 5-6 p.m. tonight. Starts to move forward, and then we get some pretty significant heavy precip rates, and you can see the particular main areas of convection will start to increase the closer you get to the coast, as expected. And we get actually some lingering storms on the back end of this, so it'll be interesting to kind of watch going into Saturday morning. And this is that one little area of convection that I'm not concerned about, but certainly it kind of might be a Saturday plan ruiner. If some of that starts to make its way, it would be great if we can get all of this out of here by the overnight hours tonight, so we can open up for a nice weekend. Might be some lingering showers and storms going into Saturday mid-afternoon. Everything should start to clear out, though, by Saturday night, and then high pressure builds in behind, and we get ourselves a very nice end to the weekend on Sunday. So let's take a look at what the precipitable water looks like. This is another way to kind of look and measure how much moisture the atmosphere is currently holding. Obviously, areas that have more precipitable water will have an increased amount of flooding precipitation, I would say. Just a lot more moisture is available in the atmosphere to precipitate. So it is precipitable water. How about that? Very self-explanatory. So any areas where you see anything going over in this darker teal, I'd say probably at this time of year in the southeast, 1.3 to 1.4 inches would be considered a pretty consistent heavy rainfall. And you can see that general area, look for that color that my cursor is currently on. That would kind of be the problem area. You can see Charleston, certainly a flooding potential for areas in flood-prone areas like Charleston, potentially Myrtle Beach, Hilton Head Island. And then that extends often into pretty much the majority of the Carolina coast, and then up and into Virginia. Now, it'll be a different value for precipitable water. That's the issue further north you go, just because of how generally colder the atmosphere is at that latitude. So even though that, up here in New England, precipitable water is, just over an inch, 1.1, 1.2 inches, that's still about the same effect in terms of how much the atmosphere will ultimately precipitate, based off of how cold it actually is at that particular latitude. So that's just what we're looking at for that particular model run. And then obviously we dry out right behind it, and we get an increase of moisture up and into the majority of the northern plains going into the beginning part of next week. Let's take a look at what the EuroAI model, which has been very good recently, is predicting in terms of precipitation for this event. So we see the majority of that precip, 2.5 inches across New England and the mid-Atlantic areas. And then you can see the coastal regions are going to be inundated with a little bit more. And then we have, pretty much generally speaking, across the majority of that southeastern coast, we have an inch of rain that the EuroAI model is predicting for this particular event. So quite interesting to see that. Well, let's take a look at temperatures. Temperatures here we have starting today, generally below average across the majority of the southeast, with the exception of the Ohio River Valley, which has been in that high pressure warm pocket on the back end, kind of in between both of these shortwave troughs. More often than not, we get as before they merge off of in the Appalachians, those particular northern and southern modes get a little pocket of warmer air that the area has been sitting in for today. So 60s, 70s actually for the areas highlighted in orange there, just slightly anomalously warm, and then we get really cold air on the back end of it. Generally the west is above average for temperatures right now. So then we go into tomorrow and we see that the general cool down begins pretty much below average across the course of the entire country, with the exception of the front range of Colorado and Wyoming. And then we keep on moving ahead. We see that another blast of cold air coming in on Montana on the back end of it, and that's where, if we go forward in time, starting into the work week, we are still generally across the southeast pretty much seasonal, maybe a slightly below average. 58s, upper 50s, upper 50s, lower 60s can be expected going into the first part of next week before things start to amp up again in the latter portions of, or the final days of the month of March. Taking a look at what the Euro and GFS model guidance is looking at. So remember, we always take a look at the Euro for what the prediction generally is, and then we take a look at the GFS to kind of determine what the confidence level is based off these numerical weather prediction models, which is different than the AI machine learning models, mind you. So we see that systems that it's going to be affecting us in the early weekend, kind of pushing through, high pressure building in on the back end, and then we get our next big troublemaker. It is not going to be a typical East Texas panhandle low. It's going to be a Colorado low, and whenever those surface lows start to form in the front range of Colorado and the north central plains, we can generally expect these lows to not even do it. Like if it was in the panhandle or a longhorn low, we'd expect it to make a big dip like this and then make its way up the coast. Not the case. When a low is situated this far north, there's not a lot of interactions that make it have to go further to the southeast unless there's a huge upper level digging trough that it would otherwise be trying to follow. So in this case, we would expect it to just kind of do a little loop-de-doo and go straight up into the Hudson Bay. And that is what we're expecting out of this particular system. Should be a pretty quick one. And not necessarily quick, mind you, but pretty severe snow event for areas that definitely need the snow in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas. And that generally... But on the back end of it, and I'll say this is the low, right? The low itself is situated here, but the ultimate trailing effects of it makes its way all the way down like this. Remember, that trough extends for as far as the cold air boundary behind it goes. So that's where we expect the severe threat coming into the Mississippi and Ohio River, Missouri River valleys going into the big part of next week. That's going to be the main storyline in terms of a tornadic threat. Wherever that triple point kind of lines up, where areas where the dry air from the dry line, we have wherever the cold front is and wherever the warm front out is in front of it, areas right above that triple point right there is going to be, and that's just an example, not saying it's going to be in Oklahoma, but that's just an explanation of what the triple point is. I'll do that without it. So we have dry line here, usually denoted, sorry, my pen is bad, usually it's like a brown line, that denotes dry air. And then out in front of it, we'll have a cold front of some kind, usually denoted by blue triangles. That denotes differences in air temperature, and then or differences where the cold air mass is. And then out ahead of the cold front, there'll be a red line. That'll be a kind of like these semicircles. That'll be your warm front boundary, where in the warm sector, air is going in this general direction. Remember, in a low pressure setting, if the low center is right here, the cold front, all of this motion is generally going to be moving in kind of this counterclockwise area. So areas out ahead of the triple point where these three areas kind of mix is where you would get the most severe initiation, I would say. So that's going to be the problem area going into next week. Obviously, it doesn't have to be at the triple point for you to have severe weather. That's just where we get our typical long track discrete supercell tornadoes. So that's just what we're going to be looking at going into that particular portion of the week. And then we extend on into, it doesn't look like, because this system starts to occlude quite early, it kind of shuts off a lot of the winds that we're going to be bringing up, all that moisture and precipitative energy. So the southeast itself Might not get any major severe threat out of this, thankfully. You can see that a lot of that, according to both the Euro and the GFS, it kind of peters out before it gets off. It actually creates a little bit of a disturbance off of the Carolinas coast. Nothing tropical, mind you. It's just once the upper level patterns, shift such where, if, let's say that we have the polar jet screaming like this, and it'll start to diverge kind of like here. So we have the low, and originally the low is kind of moving off and into this direction. Well, the residual energy from that low, as it formally shifts off into the left exit region, will kind of make a rebound effect on the back end in the right exit region, and might form its own little mini cutoff low if it has enough energy in that particular part. So I think that's what the models are kind of looking at in this particular model. Shouldn't be anything more than just might be a coastal rain event, in all honesty. And then we get another little trough that makes its way through into the weekend next week, and that is pretty much all she wrote in terms of threats to the southeast. Should be quite, according to the Euro, this is way out, mind you. This is 10 days. It's the end of the end of where we would expect to be accurate. So just keep that in mind. But could be a potentially nice end to the month, according to the numerical weather prediction models. But I don't think that's the same for our AI model that we're looking at. So let's look at what the AI model currently is seeing. We have our shortwave trough. This is starting today at 12Z, so early this morning, and then we see those two different modes, one up here digging down from the Hudson Bay, and then we have our shortwave that's making its way across the southeast. Those two systems begin to merge, and we see that, and then on the back end we get high pressure ridging behind it. Should be a pleasant start to the week for us here in the southeast, and then we get a pretty significant digging trough on the back end of it going into the middle part of next week. That's where the severe threat southwesterly flow mode is. Going into next week will be interesting to watch. And then we kind of keep on getting these, like, we keep on getting on and off. So it's like every 2 or 3 days we'll have another shortwave, another trough of some kind make its way. Should be a quite dynamic kind of system out ahead of this. So we get another digging trough going into the latter portions of next week. Now this one's interesting just because you get pretty strong southwestern, if not meridional southwesterly flow coming out into the southeast, and it's still positively tilted, but it's it's almost neutral. And whenever that kind of happens, we have maybe a more significant severe threat going into the early parts of the first week of April, which would be interesting to kind of take an eye out. That's your end of your Easter weekend, I suppose. So we have to pay attention to the timings of that. But then we get out, that starts to peter itself out, and then we get ridging out behind it. Should be a very pleasant end to that week, according to the EuroAI model. This is the short wave that it saw on the back end of it, and this is Saturday and April 6th, and of course April 8th is when I'm going to start talking about the eclipse again. But this is when we would start looking at where the eclipse track is. Generally speaking, we want to be in. We want the whole area of the eclipse track to be under these orange colors, these ridging colors, with no interactions with troughs at all, because that generally means we have high pressure aloft, or we have high pressure in general at the surface, creating a lot more cloudless skies. Clouds are the enemy going into that particular week. So we want these major troughs to stay out to sea, so we can safely say that we can see the eclipse when it occurs. Also wanted to kind of applaud the AI model as it's undergone its first month of activity in the public domain. AI has, at least in the from 4 to 5 days on, and much more so as we get to 7, 8, 9, 10 days out, has dramatically outperformed the integrated forecasting system numerical weather prediction models such as the Euro and the GFS. So the AIFS from the ECMWF Euro model has been generally very, very good, and I definitely want to be using that much more often going forward in these forecasting videos, because it seems to me at least that is the future. And then finally, we're going to take a look at what the CPC has to say in terms of, it just released yesterday its temperature and precipitation outlooks for the next from 6 to 10 days, 8 to 14, all the way out to 3 months. We can take a look at our 6 to 10 day outlook. It's generally speaking across the southeast. I'm gonna keep an eye on the southeast, because we're gonna go through the 6 to 10 day, and we're near normal temperatures, and then we're above average for precipitation. Above average for precipitation, 3 to 4 weeks out. Generally in the south, above average for precipitation. 1 month, above average precipitation. Above average precipitation for the 3-month outlook all the way out to June. And then I don't want to discount temperatures, but temperatures were also well above average as well for the majority, except in the short term. So generally speaking, this is a much more this is the transitional season. The CPC generally takes a heavier hand, I would say, at relying on the dynamic operational models, guidances, and ensembles than it does looking for climatological and tropical teleconnections, just because this is the least dominant season that they typically have an influence here in the North American subcontinent. So we take a look more at model guidance at this particular time frame of the year. April is just a it's very, very tough to forecast in a long-term guidance zone, just because it is so transitional, and there's so many different convective patterns going on, so many different atmospheric destabilizers that could occur based off of interactions between cold, warm, moist, and dry air masses that are converging due to the spring coming in. So there's a lot to consider. Very, very chaotic. But the general mean outlook, according to the CPC, is that we are in for a warmer warmer generally temperature, and more moist precipitation chance across the southeast. So quite interesting there. And of course, as one map that I saw in their announcement of this, if we're going to be under precip for an extended period of time, like we are expected to be, they have issued the 2024 U.S. Spring Flood Outlook, they essentially have a minor flood threat for the majority of the southeast, including parts of the South Central Plains and the Midwest, and then areas where you see in red are pretty much major river tributaries that are going to be affected by it. So should be a pretty wet spring going forward, according to the CPC, and we'll definitely have to take a look and keep track of where some of these major flood threats eventually start to add up on, because that's ultimately what causes floods. Just saturated ground, not able to take any more water than it possibly can because of increased precipitation. But that is all that I got for you today. I do appreciate you tuning in. Very excited next week to start talking about the total solar eclipse in earnest. So I do hope you tune in for that. Once again, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell notification, just to make sure that you are just to make sure that you get the video when it's made. And then also leave a comment. Let me know what you let me know what you thought about today's video, and whether or not you're going to be making it into the totality of the eclipse itself. I would love to hear your stories. So thank you for tuning in today. Once again, I'm Zach for Great Atmosphere, and I'll talk to you again next week for another forecasting video. Take care.